President Yoon Suk Yeol celebrates his one-year anniversary at the top office on this Wednesday, May 10th, and pundits agree his first year has seen a shift in diplomatic strategy from ambiguity to clarity amid the regional security and global economic concerns. So how is this shift in foreign strategy bolstering Seoul's interests? What have been some of President Yoon's major diplomatic wins amid this shift? And what are some of the diplomatic tasks that lie ahead? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we shed light on President Yoon Suk Yeol's foreign policy as he marks his first year in the top office, as seen by the foreign media. For more, I have Jack Barton here in the studio with me. Jack, always a pleasure to have you here.
Absolutely, wonderful to be here.
I also have Andres Sanchez Braun with us. Andres, it's good to have you back.
Always great to be here. Thank you so much.
Right, Jack, let's start with President Yoon Suk Yeol's efforts to advance diplomatic ties with neighboring Japan. Now, it has come at a cost, I'm sure you'll agree, given the reservations here on the local front amid Japan's past colonialism. But speaking as a journalist, Jack, covering the events from the outside, what are your thoughts?
It is such a thorny topic. It's so difficult because here in Korea, people of course, remember the legacy of the colonial period, the Second World War. It's a very painful memory. Most people see the relationship with Japan through the filter of the heart and the pain of the past. But looking at it with a clearer head, of course, or even just looking at it from Japan's side, you know, they say, look, in 1965, we know from declassified documents from the talks, Japan wanted the money to directly compensate the victims. It was the Korean government that said, no, we're going to compensate them. We'll take the money to create what is now the Han miracle. And as I've just been down outside the president's office for the one-year inauguration, and as one protester protesting against the protesters pointed out, Japan's apologized 54 times. That's probably enough. So, you know, it's really difficult looking at the two. One thing, though, that is very clear is the relationship has to get back on the track where you have the legacy issues going down one track, and you can argue about that, and then in the other you have diplomatic, economic, security talks on another track. That has to be done. And we saw after that 2018 court ruling for the forced labor victims and the response from the then empowered Democratic Party for the first time since the Second World War, those two crashing together and becoming a trade war and just an all-out dispute. So it needed to get back onto that track. Yoon has got it back onto that track. Has he given up too much? I would say not. He didn't give away Dokdo or do any, you know, it's would it be good if Japan, in turn, perhaps gave some more concessions? That would be nice. But the most important thing is it's back on track. But again, you know, people who see this emotively are going to have a hard time dealing with it. And I understand why it's such a difficult issue. But the fact is, Japan's not the Japan it was in 1945. You know, these are two liberal democracies. They have way more in common than either country would care to admit. And even if you can't give up those legacy issues, definitely the two countries need to work together in a much more closer fashion than they've been doing so over the past 5 years.
Right. And Andres, during the latest Yoon-Kishida summit here in capital Seoul, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida expressed his personal sorrow with regard to the past sufferings of Koreans in forced labor during Japan's colonial rule. Personally speaking, do you suppose this expression of sorrow is perhaps a step in the right direction with regard to bolstering bilateral ties?
Well, what he said was something in the line of "kokoro ga itamu omoida," which is can translate something like "my heart hurt" in the past tense when I heard about these stories of you know, victims of the Japanese colonization. So, on the one side, it sounds kind of personal. On the other, he's trying to talk in the past tense, as in, like, you know, let's try to leave these issues behind, at least when it comes to, you know, trying to rebuild bilateral ties. So yes, I think it goes in the right direction, but also I do believe that Yoon has maybe risked a little bit more, not given up, but definitely risked a bit more at home than Kishida has done so far. And definitely, according to surveys that we're seeing, what Kishida says is definitely far from what many would expect, which is a heartfelt apology. Then again, Japan has given heartfelt apologies before. I think sometimes the problem also lies within, how you follow up. The follow-up to these apologies. Are you, for example, not trying to whitewash history in textbooks, etc.? And I think the big issue here might be, well, the first question is, will Kishida, I think at one point Seoul might ask for a bit of a bigger gesture. Let's see what happens. But the question is not only if Kishida would go through with another heartfelt apology, is if the Japanese government would follow through with this apology. Let's also remember that Kishida Fumio is also a member of the Nippon Kaigi, which is an ultra-conservative lobby where many of the people in the Japanese government also belong to this lobby. So it is a complex situation, but as Jack put it, I think the greater good in this case is the need for both countries that share a lot of common values to try to build a relationship that looks towards the future, given that the present is getting more and more complex and worrying in the region.
Right, right. And staying with that, Jack, on a more optimistic view, though, there are pundits who claim that the rapprochement effort between Seoul and Tokyo will create more opportunities in the Indo-Pacific region. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And it also just takes away some immediate tensions. I mentioned Dokdo before. Even though both countries will dispute the claim over that, the tensions over that, I'm sure, will now go away. We're not going to see those incidents where we have Japanese naval and Korean Air Force sort of locking on radar. That's all going to go away. So we suddenly have a sense of calm, and the two can work together now on security when it comes to North Korea and the threat, the very real threat posed by Pyongyang. Again, they don't have to work like best friends together, but sharing intelligence, cooperating, it is very necessary. Perhaps more importantly, in the medium term, we're looking at supply lines. Now, we had that big problem when the trade row, Japan taking South Korea off its list of preferred trading partners, making it very difficult to get key components, particularly for intelligence screens, but also for semiconductors and many other things that are really key to South Korea's exports, was being put back on the list. That's all going away as well. And that's not just important for the two, that's important for the globe, which depends on these issues, but also on the region. So in the Indo-Pacific, where Japan and South Korea are very economically tied in now, particularly the ASEAN +3, so with China as well. So in many ways, it's beneficial to the whole region, to the whole globe, not just to the two. So yeah, I think the stability now and the fact they can build on it, they're talking about also in semiconductors and battery parts, trying to go further now to build real tight supply line security. It is important, and it's a very positive step.
Right. Andres, Jack just mentioned the ASEAN summit, and during the ASEAN summit in November last year, that is in Cambodia, President Yoon Suk Yeol shared his new Indo-Pacific strategy. It seemed to align quite a bit with the Biden administration's strategy, prompting quite a bit of talk about Korea shifting from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. That being said, do you suppose Korea has more to gain from the shift in strategy?
Well, maybe the question could also be which strategy, within what strategy, has the biggest potential loss lying within one of these two strategies. And I definitely think that it's ambiguity, the one that would bring a bigger potential loss nowadays, especially when we're seeing what just happened in Ukraine, or the situation in surrounding the Taiwan Strait, and the importance of this when it comes to supply chains, for example. Then again, strategic clarity does not necessarily mean that you're going to follow the footsteps of the U.S. or whoever. It doesn't mean that you have to be best friends, like Jack just put it. It means that you have to, be firm for what you stand for. And in this case, Korea's vibrant democracy, and President Yoon has spoken about Korea willing to be a compass for freedom now. And well, you know, in this sense, I think strategic clarity is definitely beneficial in the current situation.
Right, and despite Andres' thoughts, Jack, there are some who claim that Seoul needs to take on a more balanced approach to its ties with its neighbors, keeping in mind, of course, Beijing. What are your thoughts? Do you suppose Korea would gain more by taking a more neutral stance?
I think, look, Andres is right. You need clarity on issues where the clarity benefits your position. You perhaps need ambiguity on issues where there's nothing really to be gained anyway from the issue with China is a difficult one. I do find it a bit contradictory that the people I know who are ready to, you know, let's go at Japan and, you know, but let's sort of gaze at the ground and count out of China, and saying, well, it's the world's biggest economy. It's, yeah, well, Japan is number 3 biggest economy. It's just behind China. That seems to be an utter contradiction in viewpoints that I can never quite. It's not like South Korea has a wonderful past legacy relationship with China either, you know, given the Korean War and the fact that we could say the peninsula wouldn't be divided without the assistance of Beijing. So I find those viewpoints a bit contradictory. But you can have clarity without preaching. Now, I think that's a negative thing. When you start trying to tell other countries their business or whatever, yeah, that's negative. I think maybe the United States does a little bit too much of that. Maybe some other Western democracies do a bit too much of that. So yeah, ambiguity and clarity both have their strength. I think in the relationship with China, it is a difficult one. And obviously it's a neighbor, and South Korea needs to have good relations with Beijing. But at the same time, if we look at the previous administration, which was very friendly towards Beijing, and yet the economic punishment after the THAAD deployment was withering. So weakness doesn't really give you a benefit. Maybe strength does. It's hard to tell, but it's a very difficult juggling act. And the fact is, the two things Beijing was very angry about, one was the travel restrictions for COVID, but then 1 in 3 Chinese tourists were arriving with COVID. So that was a difficult spot for Seoul. And the other is the statement over Taiwan. And that's a tricky one for South Korea as well. You have almost 30,000 US troops here. If there is a conflict in Taiwan, almost certainly the US are going to want to deploy those as a forward operating base, which will drag South Korea into so it is an issue for South Korea. But yeah, do you need to make a big thing out of that? Probably not if if you're not responding to something. So I would say yes, perhaps a little bit more ambiguity, maybe, but Yoon is already quite ambiguous. Japan sees China clearly as an adversary. If we look at the Indo-Pacific document for Korea, there's not even any mention of China. So I'd say there's already a lot of ambiguity there, and perhaps he's being criticized for just bringing a little bit of clarity to the table.
Right, I see. Moving forward, Andres, prior to the ASEAN summit in Cambodia in November, President Yoon attended the NATO summit in June in Madrid. There was quite a bit of talk about his attendance there. Could you tell us a bit about the significance of his attendance? Yeah,
well, actually, that was, as I recall, President Yoon's first trip overseas after coming to power. And it was, most importantly, the first time that a Korean president attended a NATO summit, which obviously that got a lot of coverage both in Spain and on media from other NATO member countries. But I think the most important thing here probably is that after that, Korea did open a diplomatic mission to NATO in Brussels, because Korea didn't have one, and also that both parts decided to have regular annual military staff talks, and it was kind of Yoon's attendance to the summit which kick-started all of this. And then once again, both South Korea's and NATO's interests in many cases do meet. And in that sense, it's good that both parts are communicating and trying to cooperate. And that's another sign of maybe less ambiguity and more clarity.
Right. Meanwhile, back here in this region, Jack, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the Yoon administration's handling of North Korea's belligerence, can I say?
I'll tell you in 10 years, because it's going to take time to see the results. You know, when the Moon first came to office, I was really for his policy. I thought it was great, reaching out, it's needed. You know, we start talking to Pyongyang again, the summits with Kim Jong-un, really trying to get dialogue going, try to build some kind of working relationship. I thought it was a great idea, a fantastic policy, but we know in retrospect it failed. In that same period, we saw the biggest acceleration of North Korea's nuclear and weapons programs that we've seen since the creation of North Korea. So the exact opposite was the result. Now Yoon is trying something very different, a much more hardline approach, a tighter alliance with the US and Japan, and restarting those big joint military exercises again, calling for serious deterrent weapons, you know, and the US through the Washington Doctrine agreeing we're going to have submarines carrying nuclear missiles occasionally off the... All of that. Will it work? I really honestly don't know. What I can say is, since Yoon said if things get much worse, you know, we need to consider either having our own nuclear weapons or having the US deploy them, things have gotten a bit quieter in North Korea. And I can imagine that in Beijing, when they heard that, because the last thing China wants is South Korea to have nuclear weapons. Not just because South Korea will then have it, but Japan will have to follow suit. There's no way that South Korea can have nuclear weapons without Japan going nuclear as well. This is a nightmare for Beijing. And all of a sudden, things have calmed down. Now, does Beijing have a lot of influence over Pyongyang? We're going to have to, they might want to go their own way. We'll have to wait and see. But I think right now, everything is very, very difficult to see where this is going or how it will end. And I really think we're going to have to wait a few years to see if this was a good policy or a bad policy. Right now, I know he's trying something different, but I don't know.
Right, and in the meantime, though, Andres, President Yoon Suk Yeol is taking a very proactive approach with regard to Seoul's ties with Washington. In fact, he played host to the US president just a fortnight, or less than a fortnight, in the top office, and his recent state visit to the US has received quite a bit of attention, if I may say so myself. What do you suppose, Andres, are some of the tangible gains with regard to the latest Yoon-Biden summit?
Well, I'd say if I have to point out the biggest gain is actually what Jack just mentioned, in security terms, the Washington Declaration, which called for an enhancement of extended deterrence, which means that, you know, the U.S. will have to mobilize, according to this agreement, all of its military assets, including potentially its nuclear assets, to defend South Korea from an attack from the north. Now, this implies, as Jack also pointed out, that the U.S. now can deploy SSNBs, submarines that can carry missiles, ballistic missiles that can be tipped with nuclear heads, but most importantly, this nuclear consultative group, this NCG. The thing is also, there's a lot of gray areas around what this NCG means and how South Korea is going to be kept in the loop of all the important decisions in case there is a North Korean attack. And also, some people do have doubts about this actual framework being able to repel or deter a potential North Korean attack. But then again, being realistic, this was probably one of the best agreements you could get that fell short of the U.S. basically deploying nuclear weapons again in the peninsula. And I think it definitely has toned down demands for South Korea also developing its own nuclear weapons, which would bring a huge escalation in the region that would be very worrying, definitely.
Right, of course. On a light note, Jack, President Yoon's speech to a joint session of the U.S. Congress received quite a bit of applause. Some U.S. media headlines read that he won the hearts of U.S. lawmakers across the aisle. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a great speech, and you certainly prove wrong people who say he can't do these appearances abroad. It was heartfelt. He had good eye contact and, reached out to someone in the audience who was related to one of the American veterans. But I think to give it a bit of context, like I'm from Australia. We fought very hard against the Japanese who were trying to invade Australia in the Second World War. The Americans saved us. They came, and without the Americans, we would have been a Japanese colony. But does anybody in Australia say thank you for that? No, we kind of resent the Yanks a little bit, and you see that around the world. And even in Germany, or there's always this resentment of America, even though America really, with their own self-interest at heart, for sure, in many cases, came and saved us. And I think Americans get a bit sensitive about this fact that they've given up tens of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, and all they ever get in return is resentment. So for somebody to walk into Congress and go, thank you, you saved us, your guys are heroes, this is something that they never get. So on top of the fact it was a good speech and he delivered it really well, it's just something they never get in America, thank you for what you did for us, and calling the guys heroes. And the only thing I was surprised that they didn't carry him out on their shoulders, But yeah, it was an honest, heartfelt, and well thought out speech, and it didn't surprise me at all, the reaction that it got.
Right, and very briefly speaking, Andres, what were your thoughts regarding the speech?
Well, I agree. It was very well delivered. The timing was very good, also, and also let's not forget the content. It was quite comprehensive. He talked about what I already mentioned, Korea willing to be a compass for freedom, which already signals towards this policy of being with more clarity in the strategical level. He mentioned American lives that were lost defending South Korea. He mentioned also the fact, the challenges, for example, that fake news or disinformation bring to democracy. He talked about stronger trilateral cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. He was a little ambiguous there, of course. He said he would stand in solidarity with Ukraine, and we'll still have to wait what that really means. But all in all, I think it was pretty comprehensive. He actually managed to pull a couple of jokes, right? He said, even if some of you might not really know my name very well, but I'm sure you know about BTS and Blackpink. And he also mentioned that BTS did beat me to the White House, but I beat them to Capitol Hill. So.
Yeah, actually, I thought that was quite funny as well, right? Those cultural allusions were quite interesting. All right, well, Andres, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
And Jack, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow. That is Thursday.